I have a childhood friend, Emily, I've known since we were 5. We originally met because our respective fathers were both German and living in the UK, having married British women. They became friends and we were basically raised as siblings. Nothing remotely romantic has ever happened between us. It's accurate to say I treat her like I do my other sisters. People struggle at times to believe nothing has happened between us, but is it so insane for someone with 3 sisters to treat a childhood friend as a 4th? We stopped being friends briefly when she got married way too young to her boss. He ended up being incredibly abusive, controlling her life at every level, and over the 3 years they were together he basically isolated her from all friends and family. We reconciled when she divorced him. Around this time I attended university and met my now wife early on. We were assigned to the same floor in halls. We've been together for 17 years now and she's become really close to Emily over the years. Also at university I met a guy, George, on my course. We were part of the same friendship group but didn't stay in touch until we coincidentally ended up working together a good 10 years after graduation. I ended up introducing him to Emily and they started a relationship. A year or so later they moved in together. Emily was happy, he was happy. On the face of things he's seemingly been fine with me and Emily's friendship and never said anything. Over the past few weeks I started getting texts from her, sometimes late at night, that were just off. I was suspicious when she used a common British shortening of my full name rather than the traditional German version our respective fathers, and she would always use, and when some overtly flirty, almost outright sexting occurred I immediately shut it down, 100% sure it wasn't her. I basically called him out and asked if this was in fact George using her phone and bluntly asked why he was trying to sext with me as his girlfriend. He never responded, but after explaining the situation to my wife she went over to Emily's with my phone to see what was going on. I wasn't there for this, but she showed Emily our entire text history and what he had done. George came home and they confronted him. He first outright denied it and had the balls to accuse Emily of sexting me and trying to hide said cheating from my wife by saying he did it. Emily just left with my wife to come stay with us after this because there wasn't any reasoning with him. The morning after he called and begged her to come home, he was crying and threw himself at her feet claiming he did it out of jealousy. He highlighted that she was in the habit of deleting our conversations, which drove him mad, an apparent choice she makes for all her texts with everyone, not just me, and he was always jealous of our relationship. He found it hard to see me with her, and after he saw her saying stuff like how she loved me, again, siblings, not being able to read our texts drove him to basically go fishing to establish our relationship. The sexting was an attempt to bluntly see if it was something we, or more specifically I, would engage in. At this point Emily asked for mine and my wife's opinion on this whole thing. I called bullshit on this being a mistake. Something he was driven to by jealousy. He violated her privacy by going through her phone, risked our friendship by masquerading as her. Risked my marriage by trying to bait me into sexting a friend. Risked Emily and my wife's friendship by making it look like Emily was sexting me. The entire thing was a clusterfuck. I didn't outright say she should leave him, but I highlighted how dishonest this whole thing was. She eventually went back home and I didn't hear anything for a few days, but Emily eventually revealed to my wife that she had functionally forgiven him. My wife worked out from the conversation what had happened. He had basically flipped the script on me by playing into fears from her marriage. He described me as another controlling male trying to dictate who she had a relationship with. He encouraged her to make her own decision, not bad advice in theory, but she had to ignore me because I didn't have her best interest at heart. I was controlling her like her ex. My wife quietly pointed out he was in fact being like her ex, not me. He was driving a wedge between her and family. At this point Emily just gave up. Said she couldn't win, couldn't decide between the man she loves and her brother, so fuck it. Let's pretend it never happened. We haven't really spoken since. Apparently part of forgetting this ever happened is also giving into his worries about our friendship. Every time I try and bring up what he did I've either been ignored or told to stay out of it. Honestly, this pisses me off that he's gotten exactly what he wanted. He stopped us talking. I know I can't force her to break up with him, but it's seemingly a catch-22. I can't push her to make a decision about what he did whilst he's got her convinced I'm controlling her. I rarely see George at work and he's rightly kept the fuck away from me. I was tempted to bring my sisters into this clusterfuck, tell them what happened, they love her like a sister too, and see if they can talk some sense into Emily, but that's somewhat manipulative too. So any advice here? Let shitty sleeping dogs lie? Try and get her to deal with what he did rather than sweeping it under the rug? Update 1. I thought I'd update this post, seeing as there was part of a resolution and the advice was good. So, I followed the general advice of just leaving the entire situation alone. I agree any interference from me or my family would be manipulative and controlling, albeit well-meaning. So, I haven't really spoken to Emily since slightly before Christmas, but her mother contacted me a little after New Year to ask if I knew what was going on with her. Emily's cousin back in Germany had contacted her mother saying she had turned up on her doorstep having flown in from the UK on the 4th after apparently breaking up with George. According to her mother, Emily had come back to our hometown for the holidays. She brought George and at some point they ran into her ex-husband at the pub. For context, we grew up in a tiny village in the arse end of nowhere. There's literally nothing to our village but a pub, a post office and small supermarket. Her ex still lives where we grew up. So this is all information relayed to me via Emily's mother, but apparently at some point George approached Emily's ex-husband and asked for some advice. George is familiar with the story of their relationship and know how controlling he was, and why they divorced. Somewhat to her ex-husband's credit, he apparently refused to answer any questions and quietly approached Emily's mother to relay what he had asked. Now this is according to him, and George denies it, but he said George asked him how to handle me in terms of my friendship with Emily. I've no idea what Emily's ex-husband's motivation was here, but they've been divorced for a decade now and he hasn't contacted her in this time, so I'm inclined to believe it wasn't further attempts at interfering with her life. Maybe it was actually manipulation. Maybe in the decade since they've divorced he's become a better man. Who knows? We're all inclined to believe that is what was asked, despite George denying it, because how else would her ex-husband know he had an issue with me recently? He isn't in contact with anyone who would know about the recent issues. Also, to be honest, the ex never had an issue with me. He saw me as a child, despite being the same age as his then wife, and constantly called me kiddo and asked how school was. It would be a very specific shot in the dark on his part to assume George had an issue with me without George saying so himself. So, her mother told Emily what George had tried to do and pointed out that her boyfriend is now trying to emulate her ex-husband's behavior and encouraged her to confront him over this and also what happened over the last month rather than ignoring it. Nobody was privy to the discussion they had, but he left sometime after it to return to their shared home and she stayed with her mother, saying they had broken up. She stayed with her mother until the day after, where she, without any warning, left for Germany. The cousin she's staying with assures us she's relatively fine. She's just overwhelmed and embarrassed she let this happen again. She couldn't handle being where she might run into either ex, so staying with her mother was off table and she just ran somewhere far, but safe. I still haven't spoken to Emily. I've sent her a message with some condolences and reassurance she will always have a home here in the UK. I've decided to continue to give her space whilst making it clear I am there for her. She hasn't responded, but I assume this is just out of awkwardness over what happened and how technically George was once my friend. He hasn't spoken to me either and I haven't seen him at work at all. So yeah, not a happy ending per se. It shouldn't have taken her abusive ex getting involved for a resolution, but as people predicted, George was being abusive and he would repeat that behavior. I suppose it was relatively painless that he showed his true colors so emphatically without much further abuse. This could have dragged on. Thanks for the advice. Me staying out of it didn't make this any easier for her, but it probably avoided making it worse. Update 2. I jumped the gun a little with the previous update, and looking back I hadn't actually spoken to Emily and it was all second-hand information. DR of everything so far is my childhood friend, Emily, then boyfriend, George, sexted me as her to try and see if anything was going on between us. After being confronted, he approached her abusive ex-husband and she left him, realizing twice now she's fallen for abusive men. Given this whole thing has now been entirely sorted in the 3 months since it happened, I thought I'd actually give an actual full resolution. So, Emily came back to the UK just before the country was locked down and moved in with us, reluctantly. We grabbed some beers, and played Divinity 2, whilst we hashed out exactly what went down from her perspective. I apologized for going behind her back and speaking to her mother about it all. Situations like this are never helped by information being relayed through other people, and I asked if she wanted to go through it all start to finish. Basically, she buried her head in the sand the day she found out he had been trying to sex me as her. It was just too much. She couldn't win. She either lost the man she loved, and the lifestyle she had, or lost her brother. I assured her she'd never lose me, but she revealed she low-key hated the fact she let herself be taken advantage of like this twice and couldn't face me having not listened to my advice. She also mentioned that breaking up with him would inevitably land her on my doorstep for support, and that made her feel bad also, hence escaping to Germany and not talking to me about this. This went deeper and she opened up about her insecurities, how she regretted never going to university, instead marrying her abusive ex-husband, and how she feels like an accessory to other people's happiness. She saw me and my wife, a power couple, as she put it, and just felt so small by comparison. She did love George, but leaving him would leave her with functionally nothing again, and she couldn't handle that. We talked about this a lot. I revealed I aware my support of her could be a problem. I was feeling like I had made their relationship awkward by being so involved in her life. It might have been hard for George feeling like her boyfriend whilst I was there picking up her tabs, doing the DIY and basically acting like a father coddling his child. I asked if my, with retrospection, financial support of her tied into this feeling of inadequacy, like I was dragging her along for my ride, and she said it was a problem. She felt trapped when the relationship ended because she had no independence or true control. Whilst I would never use my position to control her, she would still be living by someone else's good graces. She felt she needed to stand on her own 2 feet, be her own woman rather than relying on a man, no matter how much she loved and trusted him. That way her decisions would be her own, rather than under some level of duress. In the same way a child wants independence from her parents, she feels she finally needs independence from me. So we came up with a game plan. Now the lockdown has obviously made this harder. She is still living with me and my wife currently, but the plan is she's going to go back into education. She was capable of attending university, had the qualifications, but decided not to due to marriage. My financial security was really born of an inheritance I had after my father died, life insurance. I used to not have to worry about rent during my extended time in education and early career. I bought a small flat with it I still own. I've decided to pay it forward and put her in a similar situation by letting her use my flat, which is currently unoccupied because it's only been rented to students due to its proximity to 2 universities. Yes, this is me financially supporting her, but in a strictly limited way. No more covering errant bills, paying for holidays, or footing the bill when we socialize. She will not pay rent, but she will cover all bills on the flat, and she moves out the moment she's in work. She didn't love the idea of me owning her home, but I called it my last act as that guy in her life, the pseudo brother / father / sugar daddy / best friend. After this we'll just be independent siblings / best friends. She will be moving soon. We'll need her room after all, since my wife is now 5 months pregnant. Turns out she's been pregnant since late December and all this started. As for George, he swears up and down he never asked the ex-husband to handle me. He claims he asked how to be fine with me. It wasn't seeking advice how to deal with me. It was seeking advice how to be fine with me the way her ex-husband was. Could be true, who knows? It's irrelevant ultimately. Though we recently found out George moved a girlfriend into the house him and Emily used to share, and here's the kicker. It's a long-time friend. Emily is fairly certain he never cheated on her, but she out loud laughed when she found out he's romantically living together with a long-time friend 3 months after the breakup. The dude's insecurity was likely born of his own feelings for a friend. He was getting close with a girl he was friends with, so he projected that onto me and Emily. Edit, just to clarify, because this paints a picture I don't intend. I don't pay all of Emily's bills, nor for her stuff and holidays. She doesn't want independence from me specifically, she wants independence full stop. She went from her parents, to her now ex-husband's, and then spent about a decade living paycheck to paycheck before meeting George and living largely off his money. She has no real qualifications and her current line of work has limited prospects. The things I do for her come in 2 categories, and the lack of clarity between the one-offs and the consistent things made it look like I pay for her entire world. Firstly, there's the trivial stuff I do consistently that I'm stopping as a massive overreaction to George. Logically it's fine that a brother and his wife do these things for his sister, but they weirdly make her uncomfortable, and it obviously made her ex uncomfortable. Stuff like I've done the odd bit of DIY, specifically fixing a vacuum, which isn't insane given I work in R&D for a vacuum brand, and I pay for her drinks and stuff if we socialize. I'm stopping all that trivial levels of support largely at her request to ease her discomfort at being subsidized by me. It's a pride thing. This might also help with any jealous boyfriends wrongly assuming because I pay for her cinema ticket along with my wife we're secretly Mormon. The second category were the big, one-off, things like paying that bill or buying plane tickets. Things I did in a crisis and or out of extreme generosity once. She wants to be able to be safe during shit like COVID without needing to live with me. She wants to be able to break up with a guy and be okay alone rather than crashing here. She wants to be able to fuck up a meter reading on her electricity and weather the silly bill that comes without me paying it. That happened once. I'm not gonna stop doing these things entirely. An emergency is an emergency. We won't let her come to any harm. But instead we're gonna try and make it that she doesn't need me to do these things via an education and hopefully a better job. So yeah, I don't pay for her entire life, I just muddled some big things I've done in an emergency and with some trivial brotherly support. Now on to the next story. Story 2. Wife cheated on me with my own uncle during a family crisis, but I took my revenge by doing this. My partner and I have been together for 5 years, though we had recently gotten married. We actually met on a blind date that one of our mutual friends set us up on. I was new in town and I didn't know anyone, so I jumped at the opportunity to meet someone. At the very least, I figured if there wasn't a romantic connection I would possibly make a new friend. Though, I was lucky when there was a strong romantic connection between my wife and I. She joked with me on the date that our mutual friend had always been trying to play matchmaker with her, but it never worked before. She spent the night and from there, it was like she never left. We were completely inseparable from each other. I really thought that I found my best friend when I met her. That's what makes all of this so much harder on me. I was estranged from my family at a young age and I had to work through a lot of complicated feelings toward them. My father was abusive toward me and my siblings and I decided I didn't want anything to do with it. I was the only one to leave the family and there was a lot of resentment toward me because of it. Even though I hated my father for what he did, there was still a part of me that loved him. It was very complex and hard to discuss with people. I shared everything with my wife and she supported me through a lot of things early on in our relationship. About 6 months ago I found out that my father had died. He was in a bad car accident and it took the entire family by surprise. I was saddened by the news, but I also felt extremely guilty for having cut him off. My wife and I went back to my hometown to attend the funeral. While we were there I was ignoring her a bit, not on purpose but because I was very sidetracked with my familial problems. My siblings and my mother were very cold toward me after I abandoned them. We had a lot of things to work through and I intended on trying while I was there. That left my wife alone in town for quite a while since we were there for about a week and a half. I never would have suspected she was cheating on me at the time, but looking back there were a few things that I think might have been because of an affair. One night while we were in town, she didn't come to bed. I looked around the house for her but I didn't see her anywhere. I called her to ask her where she was and she told me that she needed to get out of the house and she was on a walk. I did wait up for an hour, but I was exhausted and I fell asleep before she got home. I might have been a little too involved in the other things going on in my life to question her about it at the time, but now I think that's where this all began. After we went back home, things still weren't the same for me. I was mourning the loss of my father, and I was really grieving the fact that I hadn't spoken to him in years. There were a lot of things I never said to him that I wanted to and I felt like that chance was taken from me. However, since he was no longer around, I thought it might be good to try and rekindle a relationship with my family. My wife thought that was a good idea and she encouraged me to spend more time with them. Throughout all of that time, she was far away from me. It seemed like helping me work through some of these issues was the last thing she wanted to do. It was surprising because she had been so supportive of everything that I told her when we started seeing each other. It felt like I was living with a different person at times. She spent more time away from the house too. She would go out with her friends and it felt like she was avoiding me. One night, I asked her about what was going on and she just told me that she felt uncomfortable dealing with death, so she had distanced herself inadvertently because of that. I felt slighted by that because she was supposed to be there for me, but I didn't want to push her away anymore. I started dealing with my things privately after that. Even after I stopped going to her with the issues, she was still distant and absent from my life. Clearly what she had told me was a lie because her behavior didn't change when mine did. I started to get suspicious that something was going on. It was the last thing that I needed to be dealing with at the time, so I thought I could ignore it. At least, I thought I could do that. I was sitting on the couch next to her one night watching a TV show and I saw a number come up on her phone. I didn't recognize the number itself, but I recognized the area code. It was from my hometown. The only people she knew from there was my family, so I assumed one of them had called her. She rejected the call and I asked her who it was. She told me that it was a friend from work. I asked her about where they were from, and she told me that they lived in the city. It wasn't impossible for them to have a phone number with the area code from my town, but I just didn't believe her. She left a few minutes later, taking her phone with her to no doubt reach out to whoever that was. She had been gone for about 10 minutes when I got up to go and look for her. We were in the middle of watching a TV show together, so I was just sitting there with it paused waiting. When I found her, she was in our bedroom with her shirt off. I asked her about what she was doing, and she got kind of red in the face as if I had never seen her naked before. She told me that she splashed some water on her shirt when she was washing her hands and was just changing. I didn't believe what she said. My gut was telling me that there was something else going on. So, later that night I grabbed her phone while she was asleep and looked through it. Unsurprisingly, when I looked through her pictures I saw several that she'd clearly just taken earlier that night when she was topless. I searched through her contacts for the number that had called her earlier and I saw the messages between them. The number wasn't saved, so I didn't know who it was right away. They had been exchanging pictures and sexting with each other for weeks. It all started when we were in town for my father's funeral. I felt sick to my stomach seeing that, but it got worse when I finally realized who it was. Most of the pictures were faceless, but in one of them, I saw a tattoo that I recognized. She had been texting with my uncle. While I was home for my father's funeral, dealing with some of the heaviest things I had ever had to do, my wife was cheating on me with my uncle. He was my dad's brother, so it was even more disgusting that he was focused on sleeping with my wife during his funeral. I thought both of them were absolutely disgusting for their behaviors. I sent myself as many images and screenshots as I could. I would need them for our divorce hearings. I needed to think of something to do to get back at both of them for their actions. They deserved to be humiliated and have their lives turned upside down for what they did. My uncle was married and he had 5 children. He threw all of that away to sleep with my wife. Now that I was talking to my family again, I knew that there was a birthday party coming up for my grandma. Everyone was going to be there. So, I told my wife that I wanted to go and she happily agreed to come along. I checked her phone a couple of nights after I told her, and she had set up a date to sleep with my uncle again. I was happy to see that. Originally, I had just planned on telling everybody about what happened. But if we could walk in on them in the act, that would be even better. The day of the party came along and everything went well during the event. At the end of the night, we planned on renting one of my grandma's favorite movies and watching it together on a projector in the backyard. I know that my wife and uncle planned to sneak away at that time. When they were gone, I tapped on my aunt's shoulder and asked her if I could talk to her. We walked away from the movie and made our way inside to have a quiet conversation. I pretended like it was about gathering photos of my father to put together in a book for my uncle because I knew how close they were. She thought it was sweet. We walked into the basement together to look for the boxes of photographs that my grandma kept. As soon as we opened the door, we saw my wife topless straddling my uncle. I played it off like I had no idea what was happening and I had just stumbled in there just like my aunt had. There was a huge screaming match that ensued between my aunt and uncle. Then my wife tried to tell me that she had made a mistake and begged me to forgive her. I told her that we were done. Everybody else at the party heard what was happening and they came down to see if everything was alright. They had to explain to everyone that they had been sleeping together before we caught them. Everyone was disgusted by their actions, especially my uncle's children. They were both kicked out of the house that night. Hopefully, they at least thought about how foolish they were. My aunt ended up divorcing my uncle and is now selling the house she was awarded in the divorce. She doesn't have to split any of the profit from that with my uncle. I ended things with my wife and she got nothing from me. I had been burned by my family in the past, so I was smart enough to get a prenup. Every now and then, she'll text me when she's drunk and try to get back together with me. There isn't a chance in hell that I would ever do that.